Mask of a Diva, a Stan Kraychik mystery, Book 4, 1994. Author, Grant Michaels. Publisher, St. Martin's Press, New York. Author, Eric Aust. For all the divas, operatic and otherwise. It was a massive 3-story ocean house, a hodgepodge of architectural disunity on the outside. All the ground floor windows were actually French doors, with fan lights over the lintels. The ceilings inside looked about 20 feet high. The second floor windows were similar but without the fan lights, and the third floor windows were panned and shuttered, just like an ordinary seaside cottage. Above all that was the attic, riddled with dormers, and finally, like a ridiculous tiara, a spindly widow's walk set atop the crest of the roof. Blocking the front entrance to the mansion was a small white Japanese roadster that resembled an oversized hygiene device. Daphne said, "Someone is here already." "Silly little car," I said, and noticed the New York plate. "Don't you like sports cars?" said Daphne. "Something loud and Italian, sure, but not those." Daphne turned off the Bentley's motor and studied the little car in front of us. "New York," she mused. "It must be Bruce David." "Who's that?" "Who else?" she said wearily. "Our tenor." We were greeted at the door by a man Daphne introduced as Parker, her former chauffeur. Parker attempted the lofty manner of a British butler, but he couldn't conceal his truer self, the docile and malleable old gent. Daphne asked him, "Has Maurizio gone to pick up Sir Jonathan?" "No, Miss Davenport. I tried to explain earlier to you on the telephone, but our connection was bad. Sir Jonathan had called to say that he would not take the train after all, but would drive here directly." "How odd," said Daphne with a hint of vexation. "He told me he didn't drive." Meanwhile, I gazed around the foyer. It felt cool and light and airy, with walls of palest green and woodwork painted glossy white. Unlike the outside of the interior, the summer mansion showed the marks of a good designer. Parker continued, "I've been receiving calls all morning, Miss Davenport, ever since you left the house. Each of your guests has telephoned at least twice to ask if any of the others had arrived yet." "I recognize that game. Arrive late and with great fanfare to proclaim your supreme importance." Parker said, "Bruce David drove in half an hour ago, and to his chagrin," Peter chuckled politely, "he found himself the first one here. I took the liberty of inviting him to lunch." "Of course," said Daphne. "But he apologized that he was too tired to eat." Bruce was obviously lying low until someone else arrived. Such fragile egos, tenors. Alma me. "What about the maestro?" said Daphne. Parker answered, "Apparently he is traveling with Madama Ostinata, and they will arrive together." "Oh, very odd," said Daphne again, "and not a propitious start." Then she turned to me. "Shall we eat, then? I hope you like fresh lobster salad." She led me from the foyer through a large reception area. A broad, curved staircase descended from the second floor, and I was right above the ceiling. They were stratospheric. The French doors opened onto a broad piazza set in a checkered pattern of black and white marble slabs. From there we descended a few steps and crossed a vast manicured lawn to a screened-in gazebo that looked out over the ocean. The breeze carried the scent of salt, while picture-perfect seagulls embellished the clear blue sky. Not a bad setting for lunch. We sat, and Daphne asked me, "Iced tea or champagne?" "Your choice," I replied. She turned to Parker. "A bottle of the Roder, then." I noticed that the back of the house had a broad balcony that ran most of its length and extended out part way over the marble piazza on the ground floor. The edge of the balcony was supported by pillars running up from the piazza. Like the ground floor, all the rooms along the balcony had French doors that opened out onto it. Lunch arrived, a splendid lobster salad arranged on a bed of mixed California greens. While we ate, I learned that Daphne and I shared a background in human psychology. Although I had survived less than 2 years in clinical work, while Daphne had made a brilliant career in psychiatry under her maiden name of Wattis. It was only then that I realized who my hostess really was. Daphne Wattis had written numerous authoritative texts, some of which I had even read in college. I told her so, and she smiled. "It pleases me that my old work is still relevant," she said, "even with those inner child folks running their mouths off." Daphne Wattis had been a colleague of such luminaries as Karen Horney and Helena Deutsch. Decades back, she had even done some original and pioneering work on the psychology of arrested childhood development. But at the time, her theories had been callously dismissed by the psychiatric community as too lightweight. Daphne had maintained that the men in power simply couldn't bear hearing a young blonde woman from Southern California tell them things they hadn't imagined on their own. It would take a German to spout the same ideals before they were taken seriously. Perhaps the Teutonic weight of language had lent obedience to identical, if not plagiarized, theories. But by that time, Daphne had moved on to her research with the chemical basis of mental illness. She was just as content not to be lauded as the founder of inner child psychology, since it had been so defiled by popular culture. The occasional lecture at Harvard or consultation at McLean Hospital kept her professionally active. She asked, "Have you lost all interest in clinical work?" "I shrink 'em at the sink now," I said. "But if I ever go back to school, I'll do my thesis on the bond between hairstylists and their clients. God knows I have the case studies." The main course finished, Parker cleared the table and prepared to set out fresh fruit and small cakes. It was then we heard someone's voice exclaiming loudly, resonating from within the big house and out through some of the open windows. Before Parker could attend to the disturbance, a man in his late 40s burst from the mansion and strode angrily across the lawn toward us. His hair was dyed, that awful red some men believe conveys a youthful look, but in the bright sunlight it looked as though someone had rinsed his hair with Brasso. How could Daphne have mistaken the natural coppery sheen of my hair for that? The man shouted with a heavy British accent as he approached us in the gazebo. "What a piss-awful mess your country is!" "Oh dear," murmured Daphne. "It's the real Jonathan Byers." He stormed into the gazebo and threw himself into the empty chair next to her. "Your bleeding trains have no first-class compartments. I had to hire a car in Boston. If you think that wasn't a bloody bit of work, I'm adding it to my expenses." "Of course," said Daphne. She was about to introduce me, but Byers interrupted her. "Is this it?" he said with a reckless flutter of his hand across the table. "You call this lunch? Bloody fruit and cake?" Was he referring to me? "If you're hungry," replied Daphne, "Parker will serve you." But speaking of blood, mine was already simmering from the man's boorish behavior. Yet Daphne somehow remained unruffled and objective. She'd obviously handled plenty of aggressive patients and succeeded, something I could never do easily. I would never maintain a safe distance when facing open anger. I tended to absorb it and then get launched on the same savage ride as the instigator. Meanwhile, Parker calmly set up a table service in front of Jonathan Byers. He made a plate of lobster salad and set it before the man. Then he filled a glass with champagne, which Byers guzzled in seconds. Before Parker could return the bottle to the cooler, Byers grabbed it from his hand and refilled his glass. "Bloody cheap bastard," he muttered at Parker. "Bloody asshole," I muttered back. Jonathan Byers whirled at me. "I'll ream you bloody." Daphne didn't flinch. Parker didn't flinch. And I was saved by a deus ex machina, a blond man in his mid-20s who emerged from the house at that moment. He was clad in skimpy denim shorts, a striped cotton jersey, and white leather sneakers. He was tall, tan, smooth, and muscled and short. He was the perfect facsimile of a hustler. Jonathan Byers motioned for the young man to join us and yelled to him, "Over here, you bugger!" Then he said to Daphne, "That's young Ricky Jansen," adding with a leer, "My personal assistant. Lucky thing I pulled him out of the computer school. Raw talent like that belongs in the theater, where more people can get a good look at it." When stalwart young Ricky joined us at the table, he said to Byers, "I parked the car in the shade like you told me." I recognized a Boston accent. He'd not been Sir Jonathan's personal anything for very long, and with his lips insistently puckered, as though ready for a kiss, Rick Jansen seemed less a facsimile and more like the real stuff of a hustler. Byers gazed at him and moaned faintly, as though he'd just tasted something delicious. Then he said to Daphne, "Where's the rest of the lot of them?" She told him calmly that Mastero Tascanelli and Madama Ostinata were on their way, and that Bruce David had arrived but wasn't feeling well. "Not feeling well?" said Byers. "What is he, a withering mayfly? We've got a show opening in less than 2 weeks. I've been bloody trapped in Boston, rehearsing every screaming piece of shit in this opera except the principals, and now you tell me that our tenor's gone pansy on us. Where the bloody hell is he?" "He's resting in his quarters," said Daphne. Byers retorted, "I'll be on his quarters if he's not ready to sing tomorrow." Ricky Thing flinched at that remark. I happened to glance up at one of the second-floor windows and saw that a man had been watching our dramatic vignette through a parted curtain. Our eyes connected immediately. He vanished, and the curtain fell closed. No one saw but me. Daphne said to Jonathan Byers, "I've reserved the guest cottage for you." "The what?" he said, newly provoked. Daphne continued with the well-practiced tranquility of a veteran shrink. "Jonathan, when we spoke, you emphasized your need for complete privacy. I assumed you'd prefer the cottage, where you can be utterly alone if you want." "Where are the others staying?" "Here in the big house." "All of them?" "Yes, Madama Ostinata, Mastero Tascanelli, and Bruce David. They each have 2 rooms and a private bath, and you have the cottage all to yourself." "Why am I being separated?" "Jonathan, you are not being separated. I've given you special consideration." Byers wasn't convinced. "I don't like being separated unless I decide on it." Daphne maintained her equanimity. "If you want, there's plenty of room in the house." "I'll solve this my own way," he said. "I'll find some real privacy." He pushed his plate away, then stood up abruptly and grabbed the young Ricky Thing by his shoulder. "Come on, you bugger. Let's go get a place in town. I'll take a whole bleeding floor of that fancy hotel." He squinted his eyes at Daphne. "You hear that?" "Whatever is best for your work," said Daphne. He pointed a finger at her. "And you're paying for it." "Naturally," she said, "but I can't imagine why you'd choose to isolate yourself like that." I could. Jonathan Byers wanted quality time with his booger. He marched Rick back across the lawn toward the mansion. Though the older man led the younger, the phrase "a boy and his dog" still came to mind. "Don't forget," Daphne called out after them, "reception tonight at 6. Jonathan Byers turned back toward us and yelled, "It's not in my contract." He cuffed his young consort smartly on the shoulder, then pulled him close into a snug buddy hug. Parker gave a disdainful little snort. Daphne studied the 2 men and made a quick analysis. Despite their outward familiarity, I suspect those 2 are nearly strangers. "Not in the biblical sense," I said. "Oh dear," said Daphne. "I suppose I'm paying for that as well." I asked her why she tolerated Byers' behavior. She shrugged and shook her head. "What can I do? He creates brilliant theater." "But at what cost?" "Ironically, the people he most abuses are the very ones who beg to work with him again." "Did that include former psychiatrists?" Daphne went on. "But Sir Jonathan never uses the same cast twice." I added, "Like the best predators, he needs fresh kill." Daphne smiled. A good observation, and I hope you'll forgive me. I don't know how I mistook you for him. You have nothing in common except for your hair color." Again, I was about to object, but Daphne continued. "That man troubles me so much that I find myself denying the extent of his antisocial behavior. I'm ready to defend him and almost to admit that he has a certain charm." She chuckled and said, "Imagine that, still gullible at my age. And I'd always thought great psychiatrists were immune to such foibles." Then the great psychiatrist, "But look how well it's turned out. We got to meet each other." "I'm pleased too," I said. I thanked her for the excellent lunch and excused myself. I really did have to get to the performance center and meet the productions crew. I was there to work after all. Daphne told me that her handyman Marazzo would drive me back to town. Out in front of the mansion, when I went to get my bags from the back seat of the Bentley, Daphne stopped me. "Oh no, leave your bags here." "But..." Daphne's eyes beamed as she explained. "Since Sir Jonathan wants to choose his own accommodations, I'd like you to stay here on the estate with me in the cottage." Then she added with a hearty laugh, "That is, if you don't mind camping out with an old fogey and the would-be luminaries of opera." I replied quickly, "Not at all. And I could use some fresh young company," she said. "If there's one thing I can usually supply, it's fresh," Daphne said. "Maurizio will set you up in the cottage, then drive you down to the performance center in the Genti." She summoned Parker to get Maurizio. No sooner had Parker come and gone than a huge black limousine entered the circular driveway and pulled up to where we were standing. The uniformed driver got out and opened the back door. I felt a rush of cool, conditioned air escape from the passenger compartment. The first person to appear was a shriveled and dour woman in a plain black dress. She had that innate quality of looking older than she actually was. Her gray hair had been yanked into a masochistic chignon, and her dark, desperate eyes seemed to cry, "Salve me!" She quickly and silently moved out of the way to make room for the others. After her followed a much older man. But he was spry and slender and impeccably dressed in a creamy white linen suit. His complexion was ruddy, with taut pink skin and a big white mustache and bushy eyebrows. His eyes were bright blue and his hair a wavy mane of white. He quickly took in the mansion and the grounds, then gave a quick, approved nod and smiled broadly toward Daphne. "Buongiorno, bella signora," he said. Daphne replied with a smile. "Buongiorno, Mastello." Then from within the limousine came a shrill cry. "Angelo! Attendimi!" The old man rolled his eyes upward, then turned back toward the limousine and stooped into the open door. He held out his arm, and a plump, bejeweled hand took hold of it. The Mysterio helped the hidden person get to her feet and finally emerged from the plush compartment. Her hair was expertly frosted, a palish ash blonde that glistened in the sunlight. It complemented her golden eyes perfectly. The makeup was professionally applied but heavily handed, and unfortunately emphasized her big mouth and snouty nose, giving her face a porcine quality. She set herself firmly on her feet and sniffed at the air as if to make sure it was safe to breathe. Then she threw back her shoulders and puffed up her bosom, like a poter pigeon. She tossed her head once and delivered the line she'd probably been practicing all the way from the airport. "How do you do, Miss Davenport?" Daphne gave a dubious smile and replied, "How nice to meet you, Madame Ostinata. I hope your trip was pleasant." Madame consulted with the maestro for a quick translation, then answered with a forced, stagey smile. "It was horribly." "Horribly what?" I wondered. Daphne murmured for my ears alone. "Oh dear." Then she spoke to them all in what sounded like fluent Italian, in which I made out to be an invitation to come in and get settled and then have some lunch. Madama and the maestro nodded and smiled and made approving sounds to Daphne. But to me, Madama shot a disdainful glance, followed by an accusing flick of her fat little fingers. "Who is this?" she said to Daphne. I answered her directly. I'm doing wigs. Then I gestured with my hand to my head as if to remove my hair. Madame Ostinata teetered an obvious stage mannerism, then dismissed me with a wave of her hand. I do not need. I bring for me. But they'll still need dressing, I said. Madame quickly consulted again with the maestro, then replied to me. Mathilda will do. I looked to find Mathilda, the severe woman in black, who had withdrawn behind the rest of us. Long-suffering and apparently devoid of free will, she nodded toward Madame Ostinata. She would do her bidding. Then Daphne said blissfully, Here comes Barizzo now. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.